The day my brother handed me an eviction notice at my own mother's funeral, I didn't cry. I just stood there in the church parking lot in Mississauga, still wearing my black dress, holding a casserole dish someone had pressed into my hands, reading the words 30 days to vacate while the funeral home van pulled away. I should back up. My mother bought that house on Dunwin Drive in 1998. She saved for 11 years, working double shifts at the hospital laundry, eating sandwiches at her desk so she could put every extra dollar into her down payment fund. She always said the same thing when she talked about it. Nobody can take a house from you. She meant it as protection. She didn't know, back then, that the person she needed protection from was already living inside her. My brother's name is Warren. He's 8 years older than me, and our whole lives, he was my mother's favorite in the way that mothers sometimes have favorites, and everyone knows it, but nobody says it. He got the car on his 16th birthday. He got the car on his 16th birthday. He got the extra helping at dinner and the benefit of the doubt in every argument and the gentle voice even when he was wrong. I got the expectation that I would be grateful for whatever was left. I moved back home at 27. I know what people think when they hear that. I've heard it. But here's what was actually happening. My mother had been diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia, and she needed someone there. Not occasionally. Every day. Her doctor, Dr. Meta at Credit Valley, had been very direct with me on the phone. The progression could be slow or it could accelerate, but she shouldn't be alone and she needed consistency, someone who knew her routines, someone she trusted. Warren had a house in Oakville, a wife, 2 kids in private school, a job he described as consulting that seemed to involve a lot of lunches. When I called him after Dr. Meta called me, he said, "That's terrible news." And then he said, "I'm sure you can handle it." And then his wife said something in the background and he said he had to go. So I handled it. I gave up my apartment in Hamilton. I packed everything I owned into a rented cargo van and drove it to Mississauga on a Tuesday in November. I set up the medication calendar on the fridge. I learned which foods my mother could still manage and which ones made her choke. I drove her to her appointments. I sat with her on the bad nights when she woke up not knowing where she was, calling for people who had been dead for decades, and I held her hand and told her she was home, she was safe, and eventually she would settle. I did not charge her rent. I paid for my own groceries, and I paid a portion of the utilities, and I handled the yard in the summer and the driveway in the winter. I was there. Warren visited at Christmas and at her birthday. He brought flowers. He sat in the living room for 2 hours and talked about his kids' hockey schedules, and then he hugged my mother for a long time and cried a little in the driveway when he left, and I watched from the window and felt something I didn't have a name for yet. For 2 years I did this. I also worked remotely, part-time, then eventually full-time again when I figured out how to manage both. I was a bookkeeper for 3 small businesses, all contractors, all referred through word of mouth. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and I was good at it, and I could do it from the kitchen table while my mother watched her programs in the next room. My mother died on a Wednesday morning in March. She had been declining for 6 weeks. Hospice had been coming in daily. I had slept on the cot in her room for the last 4 nights because something in her breathing had changed and I didn't want her to be alone. She died at 6:14 in the morning very quietly, and I held her hand the whole time. Warren arrived 3 hours later. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment, and then he said, "She looks peaceful," and I said, "She was," and we stood there in silence for a minute. Then he said, "We need to talk about the house." I thought he meant later. I thought he meant after the funeral, after the paperwork, after the grief had done whatever it was going to do to both of us. I said, "Okay," and went to make coffee. He meant right then. He sat down at the kitchen table, my mother's table, where I had been working for 2 years, and he told me that he had spoken to a lawyer, that the house was in both his name and my mother's, had been since 2014, that she had added him when her diagnosis first came because she had been worried about what would happen to her estate. He showed me the paperwork on his phone. He said he was planning to sell and that he needed me out within 60 days. I said, "Warren, I live here." He said, "I know, and I'm giving you 60 days. I said, "I've been here for 2 years. I took care of her." He said, "And that was very appreciated." That was the word he used, appreciated. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I sat very still and looked at the grain of the table and thought about my mother saying, "Nobody can take a house from you." And I thought about how wrong she had been, and I thought about my brother crying in the driveway at Christmas while I watched from the window, and I finally had a name for what I had felt. I had felt the future arriving. I just hadn't known what shape it would take. The day of the funeral, Warren handed me the formal notice in the church parking lot. He had it in a manila envelope. He said his lawyer had advised him to do it properly to start the clock. I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. He put it in my hand like he was passing me a church bulletin, and then he walked back toward his car. I stood there holding a casserole dish. That night, alone in the house, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I had $43 in my checking account. I had a part-time client list that had shrunk when I'd reduced my hours to care for my mother. I had no apartment, no lease history for the past 2 years, and apparently no claim to the place I had been sleeping, eating, and breathing in since before my mother had stopped recognizing my face on bad days. I did not sleep that night, but I also did not panic. Something had settled in me that I can only describe as the absence of more illusions. There was nothing left to hope Warren would do differently. There was nothing left to wait for. I had 60 days and I needed to use them correctly. The first thing I did was call a tenant rights line. This was a Friday morning, and I was on hold for 45 minutes, and when I finally spoke to someone, a woman named Miss Park, very calm, very thorough, she explained to me that in Ontario, even without a formal lease, I had rights as an occupant who had been living in the property for over 2 years and contributing to household expenses. She used the phrase "notice to vacate requirements" and told me that 60 days might not even be the legally required minimum depending on my situation, and that I should document everything I could about my time in the house, my contributions, my role as a caregiver. I wrote everything down, every receipt I could find, every pharmacy run, every medical appointment in the calendar on my phone, every e-transfer to the utility companies. 2 years of a life, itemized. The second thing I did was call my mother's lawyer. Not Warren's lawyer. My mother had her own, a woman named Ms. Rourke who had done her will years ago. I didn't know if there was anything to find, but I needed to know what I was dealing with. Miss Rourke was not able to discuss the file with me on the phone, but she agreed to a meeting the following week, and the way she paused before she agreed made me feel like the meeting was worth having. In the meantime, I reached out to 2 of my old bookkeeping clients who had stopped using my services when I went part-time. One didn't respond. The other, a contractor named Patrick, who ran a small renovation company in Burlington, said he had actually been meaning to call me. His current bookkeeper had made a mess of his HST filings and he was facing a CRA review. He asked if I could help. I said yes. I worked on Patrick's files for 6 days straight. I found the errors. I drafted the response to CRA. I organized 18 months of receipts that had been kept in a plastic bin in no particular order. When I submitted everything, he said it was the cleanest documentation package his accountant had ever seen. He paid me $3,000 and asked if I could take him on full-time going forward. That was the first piece. The meeting with Ms. Rourke happened on a Thursday morning. She had an office on Huron, Ontario, small, full of files, a plant on the windowsill that had seen better days. She sat across from me and she looked at me for a moment before she said anything the way lawyers do when they're deciding how to frame something. She told me that my mother had updated her will 14 months before she died. That in this updated will, she had left the contents of the house, the furniture, the personal items, the things she had accumulated over her life, to me, not to Warren. She had also set aside a small amount, $12,000, from a savings account that Warren did not know about, in a separate provision that named me as beneficiary. Then Miss Rourke said there was something else. She said that my mother had come to see her alone without telling Warren about 18 months before the update, that she had been concerned about the 2014 title change, that she had told Ms. Rourke she wasn't sure she had fully understood what she was signing, that Warren had brought her to his lawyer and told her it was just a formality, just to protect everyone. She had been frightened. The dementia was early enough that she knew something was wrong, but not advanced enough that she couldn't see it. Miss Rourke had recommended she get an independent assessment of her capacity at the time of the 2014 signing. She had also made a note in my mother's file. She handed me a copy of the note. I read it twice. Then I called a lawyer of my own. My lawyer's name was Mr. Osei, referred by Miss Rourke, experienced in estate disputes, very direct in the way that good lawyers are direct. He read the file, he read the note. He said the 2014 title change was potentially challengeable on the grounds that my mother had not had independent legal advice, and there were questions about her capacity and her understanding at the time. He said it would not be fast and it would not be cheap, but that I had more standing than I might think. He also pointed out something that I had not considered, that I had 2 years of documented caregiving, that in Ontario there are provisions, not widely known, but there, for caregivers who provides significant unpaid labor to a family member's estate, and that this could be relevant to a claim on the estate's value independent of the title dispute. I had been inside that house for 2 years, making no money and asking for nothing. The law had a name for that. It was called unjust enrichment, and Warren had been enriched by it. I won't pretend the next few months were easy. They weren't. I was sleeping in the house on Dunwin Drive while the legal process moved at whatever pace it moves, and Warren had retained his own lawyer, and there were letters and counter-letters, and one very unpleasant phone call during which he told me I was being ungrateful and selfish, and that I was destroying the family. I said, "Which family?" He didn't answer. What I discovered during this period, almost by accident, was that the 2014 signing had not been the first time Warren had involved himself in my mother's finances. While I was going through her files in the bedroom closet, looking for the household receipts Miss Rourke had asked me to gather, I found a folder tucked behind her winter sweaters. Inside it were bank statements she had printed off and kept, statements from an account at a different bank than her main account. Statements that showed regular withdrawals, amounts between $400 and $800, made every 6 to 8 weeks going back to 2016. Sechant. The withdrawals were not to her. The transfer recipient was identified only by an account number. But the amounts were consistent and the timing was regular. I brought these to Mr. Osei. He brought in a forensic accountant. The forensic accountant traced the account number. The transfers had been going to Warren, not to Warren's business, not to a joint account, to a personal account in his name that my mother had been wiring money to at regular intervals for 6 years. There was no loan agreement. There was no record of any repayment. There was no record that she had ever received anything in return. My mother had been supporting her son for 6 years while I was the one who showed up to take care of her, and she had kept that folder behind her sweaters because some part of her, even through the fog, knew that something wasn't right and she was trying to hold on to proof of it. I think about her tucking those statements into that folder. I think about the kind of love that keeps making deposits even when it knows something is wrong. Warren was served with a legal claim in June. The claim cited 3 things: the 2014 title transfer under potential undue influence, 6 years of undisclosed financial transfers from my mother's personal account, and an unjust enrichment claim related to my unpaid caregiving labor. Mr. Osei put the total value of the claim at just over $280,000, which was the assessed value of the equity in the house plus the 6 years of transfers. Warren called me the day after he was served. He was not calm. He said I had no idea what I was doing. He said our mother would have hated this. He said I was tearing apart everything she built. I let him finish. Then I said, "She kept those bank statements behind her sweaters, Warren." She knew the line was quiet for a long time. He said, That's not what you think it is. I said, then explain it to Mr. Ose. He didn't have an explanation for Mr. Say. What he had instead was a settlement offer which arrived through his lawyer 3 weeks later. He was willing to relinquish his claim to the house entirely, to let the title revert to my mother's estate, which passed to me under the updated will, in exchange for me dropping the financial transfer claim. Mr. Ose and I talked about it for a long time. The honest answer was that the financial transfer claim would be harder to litigate. My mother had made those transfers voluntarily. Proving undue influence over years of transactions with a dementia diagnosis in the background was going to be complicated and expensive and slow. The house was worth far more, practically speaking, than the transfers. I took the settlement. The house on Dunwin Drive was mine. I sat in the driveway the night the paperwork was finalized, and I cried for a long time, not because of winning anything, because I had walked through the front door of that house 2 years ago to take care of my mother, and she had died in a room down the hall, and now I was sitting outside it at 10 o'clock at night in October, trying to understand what it meant that I was still here, and she wasn't. But I was still here. The clients I had taken back during those months had talked. Patrick had referred me to someone else, and that person to someone else, and by the following spring, I had 8 regular clients and a wait list. I hired a part-time subcontractor to help with the overflow. I set up a proper home office in what had been my mother's sewing room, and I put one of her plants on the windowsill, and I worked. Warren and I have not spoken since the settlement. I don't know if we ever will. I know that there are people who will hear this story and think I should have found a way to reconcile, that family is family, that my mother would have wanted peace. Maybe. But my mother also kept those bank statements behind her sweaters, and she updated her will 14 months before she died, and she asked Miss Rourke to write down what she had told her. She left me what she could. She did it quietly, in the only ways she still had available to her, and I think that is its own kind of answer. The house needs a new roof. I've been saving for it. The front garden, which my mother kept beautifully every summer, went wild the year she got sick, and I never had time to fix it, but this spring I put in raised beds and plant tomatoes and the basil she always grew by the kitchen window because she said it kept the flies away. I don't know if it works, but it smells like her. And some mornings I come downstairs and the sun hits the kitchen at the right angle and the whole room smells like basil and coffee and something older, something from years before any of this happened. And I sit down at the kitchen table and I breathe. Nobody can take a house from you. She was right about that. In the end, she just didn't know who was going to have to fight to keep it.